Established in January 1916 in the Wellington Cafe to the right of this photo, the New Zealand Women's Anti-German League was just that, vehemently to the point of outright hostility, maniacal towards Germans and Austrians to boot. Campaigned variously for German products to be stripped from the shelves, when at best these constituted 5 to 10% of imported goods even prior to World War I, then upped the ante by targeting those with vaguely German-sounding surnames, wanting them to be banned from the army and civil service with varied success. One of the more high-profile of the wins, so to speak, was a Victoria University professor. His crime was that he simply had a German father. What was left out was he also had an English mother, left Germany for England when he was a toddler, ended up in New Zealand in his 20s, and was married to the daughter of the Mayor of Lower Hutt. Under pressure, the government buckled and inaugurated the Alien Enemy Teachers Act, a thinly veiled piece of legislation in order to ask von Ledlitz legally. He wouldn't be reinstated until 2 decades later. On the other side of the coin, Lieutenant Alexander Hugh Grierson, where we now border the territory called Farcical. Grierson was born and spent most of his life in Southampton, learnt German at school and travelled there as a tourist. This came to the notice of his busybody landlady, who spotted a German dictionary in his room. She notified none other than the actual founder of the Anti-German Women's League. This charming lady, don't like yours. And whilst Grierson was away, they went through his room, finding more incriminating evidence in the form of pictorial books on Germany. Where's Gilbert and Sullivan when you need them? In their minds, they had located one of the 20,000 enemy aliens they said posed a threat. And they then went full native, as the clipping indicates, straight to head office. The army, though, stood staunch. Grierson sailed off with the 12th and promptly got ill upon arriving in the Middle East, ultimately never fired a shot. And those 2 high-profile incidents paints the picture. The League weren't that fussed with building a case built on substantive evidence. A great-grandfather who was German was enough. Dutch, Scandinavians, Danes, Poles and Dalmatians in New Zealand were suddenly having to explain their heritages. Point to school atlases. Calls for also made from the group and others of the ilk, of which you will shortly learn there were many, to in turn all those of German heritage, even naturalised Kiwi citizens. These weren't women who wanted to keep the home fires burning, they wanted to keep them raging. This anger was palpable as the death toll amongst Kiwi soldiers rose, further fuelled by civilian deaths on board the vessel's Lusitania in May 1915. The Kiwi nurses who went down with the Marquette in October the same year, both struck by German submarines, unbeknownst to the public of the day. The 2 were carrying munitions, supplies for the war effort, in contradiction to the laws of warfare, thus fair game. The video I did on that follows, or is in the description. Also, a quick opportunity for me to say thank you to those who have donated to my caffeine addiction. Thank you very much. The campaign to not buy German-made products was less insidious, though self-evidently pointless, given the borders and trade were obviously closed. The upshot of the relentless banging on the drum would ultimately result in violence, senseless violence that only largely occurs when large groups of humans congregate, mobs take over. This occurred in the wake of the Lusitania sinking, 15th of May 1915, Wanganui. The locals wanted blood. In the preceding days had made no secret. Their target was to be the butchery owned by naturalised New Zealand citizen Conrad Heinold. It was a Saturday evening, and just after the pub closed, 3,000 people gathered outside his shop, broke through the police cordon and indiscriminately pelted the shop with rocks and anything else that could come to hand. Their aim wasn't particularly good. The neighbouring shops also had their windows and frontages destroyed. They weren't finished there, and not by a long shot. Right around the corner was the local branch of Hallenstein's department store. The overwhelmed police could only be spectators as the mob took the windows out of that establishment. Then, for good measure, round off a good night, a couple of doors down was a branch of the Needham piano manufacturing company called Bristol's. Their sin, they sold a range of pianos called Dresden. Rocks met glass. Fearing a repeat, Bristol's undertook a nationwide campaign to reinforce their Britishness, promptly renaming their Dresden range. And speaking of which, German street names were being expunged en masse. Geographic locations like a German Bay near Akaroa purged. Franz Joseph Glacier, Haast Pass, Haast River, Humboldt Mountains, the village of St. Arnolds, all came within a whisker of meeting the same fate. Animals, they weren't exempt, and German shepherds were renamed Alsatians. Before you now think this sort of over-the-top xenophobia, combined with outright historical ignorance, could never happen today in peacetime. I'll leave the headline from last year on your screen for 10 seconds. Let it sink in. Lutheran churches became a somewhat easy target of attacks, set alight and vandalised in the middle of the night. Sometimes openly, in full gaze, as a press photographer snapped away. And poor old Charles Hodgson, he was born in London to a German father by the name of Schultz, English mother, Hodgson. Throughout his life, he'd variously called himself a Charles Schultz, a Charles Hodgson Schultz, and Charles Hodgson. By the time he arrived in New Zealand via Australia, he'd dropped the name Schultz. When the authorities found this out, he ended up in court in Christchurch, was fined as an enemy alien. His crime? His heritage, that's to say his father was German, meant potentially he could apply for German citizenship, and he hadn't revealed this heinous fact to the police. Cripes, the poor bloke had never even visited Germany. By now, the way I've painted it, you are probably thinking the Women's Anti-German League were fairly successful in their aims. It's just, and they weren't alone. Far from it. Even before the hostilities, that space was well covered with imported leagues like the ones on your screen, British prototypes, who couldn't abide Germans, Prussians, etc. These pre-war groups often sprouted out of the Boer War. When hostilities started, it became rather crowded. Kiwis were spoilt for choice. Then within those groups were, more often than not, a woman's wing. Overall, the Patriotic Association appeared to have been the biggest. The Girls' Realm Guild doing their bit. Lady Ward and Mrs. Massey. Back now to the Women's Anti-German League. Their over-the-top plans to squeeze out imaginary Huns, which I have to add for the record, clarity, the list of German spies caught in New Zealand started at the outbreak of WW1 at 0 and ended on 0. The police were kept unnecessarily busy with threats upon the aforementioned innocent immigrants with non-anglicised names and petty vandalism to their properties, following up little more than rumour and innuendo and chasing shadows. As we saw with COVID, paint a group like the unvaxxed as the enemy, people turn nasty and vindictive. Those with nothing much else to do with their lives also become the butt of derision with those who do. This was the category the anti-German Women's League were lumped into. Even in the atmosphere of anti-German fervour, the Women's League was seen in many quarters as little more than over-imaginative busybodies who painted the innocent as collaborators and tarnished their names for decades to come, saw smoke where there wasn't even a fire, were overdoing the hatred business, dabbling in what the press were calling the nonsensical, even, as this next article states, a bunch of cranks. Yell wolf enough when there isn't one, and people first ignore you, and then if you continue the practice, they begin to question your mental state. This was exactly the fate of the Women's Anti-German League. Thanks for tuning in today. You have another 10 minutes to spare. Give the Marquette sinking a once-over. Cheers to those that support my efforts. I do appreciate it, troops. Bye for now.